Have you ever felt the weight of silence? That kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace but from fear? The kind of silence that makes every beat of your heart echo like a war drum? I lived it, and what I'm going to tell today still haunt me on moonless nights. The name is Sam Houston. Perhaps they have heard of me through history books, general, political, the man who helped shape Texas. But what the books never told, what I never had the courage to reveal so far, are the experiences I have lived in the wild lands of the Pecos River. Experiences that have changed forever. My understanding of what exists beyond the veil of reality. Have you ever wondered why certain lands remain deserted, even when they offer everything a man needs to thrive? Why do some rivers run so silent that even birds avoid their margins? Why are there places where the air itself seems to carry whispers from forgotten times? Welcome to the dark heart of Texas, where the waters of the Pecos River keep secrets that should not be unearthed. I am Sam Houston, and this is the story I have never told so far. The call of the dark water. It was the winter of 1843. Texas had gained its independence, but we still fought to define our borders, especially to the west, where the river serps, through lands that seemed forgotten by God. I received worrying reports from settlers from the city of Pecos City, people disappearing without traces, cattle being found mutilated in ways no known predator could cause. As President of the Republic of Texas, it was my responsibility to investigate. But if I knew what I was waiting for me in those turbid waters, I would have sent an entire army. I started from Austin with a small escort. 5 good men, veterans of the Revolution who did not know fear. At least, that's what I thought. Among them was Jake Morrison, a scout that knew every track of West Texan as the lines of his own hand. Tom Bradley, a military doctor who had seen enough horrors on the battlefield to maintain sanity in any situation. And 3 soldiers, Miguel Santos, Robert Red O'Malley, and William Cross. The journey to Pecos City took 4 days. With every mile we advanced west, the world seemed to be quieter. The green prairies of the east gave way to an arid and desolate territory. The sky, always vast in Texas, seemed even more infinite there, and more empty. It was Morrison who first noticed the absence of wildlife. "General Houston," he said on the 3rd night as we fed our fire with dry mesquite branches, "have you noticed? We haven't seen a coyote even in the last 2 days. Not even a badge." He was right. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crepitate of the flames and the whisper of the wind through the sparse vegetation. It was as if every form of life had fled from that region, leaving only an oppressive void. "Perhaps the drought turned the animals away," Bradley suggested, but his voice carried an uncertainty he couldn't hide. "There was no drought here," replied Morrison, shaking his head. "The vegetation is green, the streams run full, but there is no life. It's like..." He stopped, looking for the right words. "As if something had driven every living creature." The next morning we saw the Pecos River for the first time. It was a serpent through the landscape like a dark scar. On the earth, its waters running with a color that was neither brown nor green. Something between the two, turbous and unsettling. The margins were curiously devoid of the exuberant vegetation that usually accompanies the rivers in Texas. Only a few twisted willow and sparse shrubs grew there, as if the earth itself rejected anything in those waters. Pecos City. Accursed. City Pecos. City was not quite a city. Another cluster of precarious buildings and tents that had emerged around one of the few points where the river was easily crossable. Perhaps 50 people lived there, most traders and adventurers seeking fortune in the unexplored lands of the West. What received us was a deadly silence. The streets were deserted under the noon. Some doors swung open in the wind, but there was no sign of human life. "Where is everyone?" It murmured Red O'Malley, his hand instinctively resting on the pistol fist. We went down from the horses in what seemed to be the city center, a dusty square surrounded by a saloon, a general store, and some other establishments. It was then that we heard a weak voice calling for help from the interior of saloon. We found the man in a dark corner of the establishment, shrunk behind the counter like a wounded animal. It was thin, middle-aged, with eyes that had seen too much things. When he saw us, he began to tremble. You shouldn't have come," he said with a hoarse voice. "No one should be here. Not after what happened." "I'm Sam Houston," I introduced myself. "President of the Republic of Texas. We received reports of problems in this region." The man looked at me with a mixture of relief and terror. "General Houston, my name is Josiah Parker. I was the mayor of this city, or what is left of it." "Where are everyone?" Bradley asked, approaching carefully. Parker closed his eyes as if trying to remember. He was physically painful. "It started 3 weeks ago. The children were the first. Emma Sullivan, just 7, disappeared while playing near the river. We found only her shoes on the bank." He stopped, swallowing dry. "Then it was Mr. Hendricks. He was a strong, brave man. He said he was going to look for the girl. He came back 3 days later, but—" Parker shuddered. "It was no longer the Hendricks we knew." "What do you mean?" I pressed. "His eyes, General. They were white like milk. And he spoke in tongues that none of us recognized. Ancient languages, as if they came from a while before time. And at night, he walked toward the river." Morrison approached. "Where is he now?" "It disappeared a week ago. He went out at night and never came back. But sometimes we still hear him calling the other side of the river, calling our names." Parker's story continued for another hour. More disappearances, animals found dead without visible injuries, strange sounds coming from the river at night, voices whispering in unknown languages, corners that seemed to come from under the water. "Most people ran away last week," Parker concluded. "They packaged everything they could carry and left. I couldn't leave. This city was all I had." When we asked why he thought it was happening, Parker told us about the local legend. "The old Mexicans who lived here before us talked about it," he said. "They called the river El Rio de los Muertos, the river of the dead. They said that a long time ago, an entire tribe was massacred in these banks. Hundreds of people. Their souls never found peace. I was a practical man, shaped by war and politics. But something in Parker's voice, in the deadly void of that city, made a chill through my spine. The first night, whispers in darkness. We decided to spend the night in Pecos City to further investigate. We established our camp in the central square, where we could maintain observation in all directions. Parker refused to stay with us outdoors, locking himself in saloon as soon as the sun began to put on. "Don't get out of sight of each other. It was your last warning. And no matter what they hear at night, they don't get closer to the river." The first hours were normal. We eat dried meat and talk low on our plans for the next day. Bradley examined some of the abandoned houses, looking for medical clues about what could have happened to the missing ones. Morrison studied the tracks around the city, trying to find some pattern in the disappearances. It was around midnight that the whispers began. First, I thought it was the wind, a low murmur from the direction of the river, like air passing through foliage. But gradually the sound has become more distinct. Voices, multiple voices whispering in unison. "Are you listening to this?" Santos murmured, his hand squeezing the rifle. We all heard. The whisper grew in intensity, not exactly louder but more penetrating. It was as if the voices were moving closer, surrounding our camp. Red O'Malley got up slowly, looking toward the river. "General, there is something wrong with those waters." We followed his gaze and saw something that froze our blood. The Pecos River, which had been dark and silent during the day, was now shining with a pale and sickly light. It was not exactly light, more as if the darkness itself was shining. "Do you see that?" he whispered cross, pointing to the waters. There were shapes moving under the surface, shadows that seemed to dance in the deep, and the more we looked, the clearer they became. Human figures, dozens of them, walking slowly under the water toward us. Bradley, always the most rational among us, tried to find a logical explanation. It must be some kind of natural phenomenon. Reflection of the moon, maybe. But his words died when one of the figures partially emerged from the water. He was a man, or had been a man. Her skin had the color and texture of wet clay, and her eyes were 2 black holes that seemed to suck the light around. He looked at us straight, and when he opened his mouth, it came out dirty water instead of air. Then another came, and another. and soon the riverbank was full of semi-submerged figures, all staring at us with those empty eyes. The whispers became more intense, and now we could distinguish words, or something like words. It was a language that none of us recognized, but we somehow understood the meaning. They were calling us, inviting us, promising us eternal peace in cold and dark waters. "Do not look straight at them," I commanded, although my own voice trembled. "Don't listen to what they are saying." But it was too late for Cross. He had risen and walked slowly toward the river, as if in a trance. Morrison was the first to react, jumping to intercept Cross before he could arrive very far. Willie, wake up!" When Morrison played Cross, he turned violently. His eyes had changed. They were still their own eyes, but there was something more in them, something old and hungry. "They are calling me," Cross said with a voice that wasn't his own. "I can hear them singing. It's so beautiful, so peaceful." We took more than an hour to bring Cross back to lucidity, and throughout this time the figures in the waters remained there, watching, whispering, waiting. When we finally managed to break any influence they had on him, Cross collapsed as if ran miles. She didn't remember anything after looking at the river. The rest of the night we spent on a constant vigil, taking turns that someone was always awake. The figures in the water remained even before dawn, when they simply faded like fog before the first ray of the sun, the secret of the damn river. The next morning we sought Parker to tell what we had experienced. We found him in the pale and tremendous saloon, as if he had spent the night facing demons. Didn't you see?" he said even before we could speak. "The dead, they come every night now, since the disappearances have begun." "Parker," I said, sitting in front of you, "I need you to tell me everything you know about the history of this earth, and I want the complete truth." He sighed deeply, like a man about to confess his darker sins. "The real story did not start with the Mexicans, General. It started long before. There is an old Spanish mission about 5 miles upstairs. It is in ruins now, but there are still documents there. Records of a priest named Friar Miguel Vasquez. Parker told us that he had explored the ruins of the mission a few months before the disappearances began. In the documents he found, there were reports of foreign events dating from 1720. The priest wrote about a tribe that lived on the banks of the river, the Pieces, which named the region. But they were not an ordinary tribe, General. They practiced odd things, rituals that involved human sacrifices to what they called El Dios del Rio, the river god. According to Fray Vasquez's records, the Spaniards initially tried to convert the tribe peacefully, but the rituals continued, becoming more frequent and more bloody. Children from neighboring tribes began to disappear. Spanish traders traveling around the region never reached the destination. "The priest wrote that the river itself seemed to be changing," continued Parker. "The waters got darker, fish began to die, and at night, voices could be heard singing under the waters. The situation became unsustainable when the Spanish soldiers themselves began to disappear. A military expedition was sent with orders to end the tribe once and for all. It was a massacre, General. They all killed. Men, women, children. Hundreds of people. And they did it on the banks of the river during one of the tribe rituals." Parker stopped, his hands shaking as he held a cup of cold coffee. "But the priest wrote something strange. He said that when the last member of the tribe died, the waters of the river began to bubble as if they were boiling. And then, the bodies of the dead simply disappeared. They did not float downstream. They did not sink. They just disappeared, as if the water had swallowed them." "And after that?" asked Bradley. "The mission was abandoned within a year. The priests reported terrible dreams, visions of the dead walking under the waters. 3 priests disappeared at night. Fray Vasquez was the last one from, but before he sealed the records and cursed anyone who tried to disturb the river again. The story explained a lot, but raised even more questions. Why were events happening now, more than a century later? What had aroused the dead in their aquatic tombs? It was Morrison who asked the question that we were all avoiding. "Parker, you said you explored the mission a few months ago. Did you get something out there?" The silence that followed was our answer. Parker finally nodded, tears running down his cheeks. "There was an artifact, a kind of stone altar with carved symbols. I thought I could sell it to some collector in Austin. I brought it here and put it on the bank of the river, as I decided how to transport it. Where is it now? I asked, although I knew the answer. It disappeared the first night that the whispers began. It was as if Rio had complained back. The journey to the lost mission. We decided that our only chance to understand and possibly resolve the situation was to explore the ruins of the Spanish mission. Parker offered to guide us, although he clearly preferred to never see that place again. The river journey above took almost all day. The landscape became progressively more desolate as we advanced. The plants themselves looked sick, willow with twisted branches as arthritic fingers, a grass that grew in strange and unnatural patterns. The river ran beside us, silent and dark. Occasionally, we saw surface ripples that did not seem caused by the wind or fish. They were very large, very deliberate, as if something immensely moved in the depths. "General," said Santos at one point, "my grandfather was Mexican. He used to tell stories about rivers like this. He said some rivers are not just water, they are portals, places where the living world finds the world of the dead." I didn't answer, but your words echoed in my mind. There was something fundamentally wrong with those waters. They did not reflect the sky like normal water should do. Instead, they seemed to absorb light, creating a surface that was like looking at an abyss. The ruins of the San Miguel mission appeared in the late afternoon, crowning a small elevation that dominated a river curve. Even at a distance, it was clear that this place had been abandoned in a hurry. Adobe walls collapsed, wood beams rotted under the open, and an atmosphere of melancholy hovered over everything. But it was when we approach that we truly feel the weight of the story of that place. The air itself seemed heavier, thicker. Our horses became nervous, reluctant to approach the ruins. "They feel," Parker murmured. "Animals always feel when a place was touched by death." We left the horses tied to a dead tree a good distance from the ruins and continued on foot. The main entrance of the mission had collapsed decades ago, but Parker guided us through a side opening that led to what had been the chapel one day. The interior was a panorama of destruction. Wooden seats rotted on the ground floor, covered by decades of leaves and debris. The altar had been broken, as if by force tremendous, and on the walls there were marks that none of us could explain. They were not common graffiti or vandalism. They were deeply sculpted symbols in the stone, complex spirals, humanoid figures with distorted characteristics, and images that seemed to show people being dragged under the water. "Jesus Christ," whispered Red O'Malley. "What kind of people did these things do?" Bradley, always analytical, approached the walls to examine the symbols more closely. "These were not made by the Spanish," he said. "The style is completely different, and look at the depth. They must have taken years to sculpt." "The Indians' Pecos," said Parker. "They must have used this chapada as a sacred place long before the Spaniards arrive. Perhaps for centuries. We found Fray Vasquez's records on a crypt behind the altar. They were sealed in a metal box that had resisted at time and weather. The documents confirmed everything Parker had told us, but contained additional details that froze our blood. The priest had made desperate attempts to understand the religion of the parts. His writings described rituals where members of the tribe drowned voluntarily in the river, believing that this would turn them into eternal servants of their aquatic deity. The survivors claimed that they could hear the drowned singing under the waters, guiding others to join them. But the most disturbing passage was in the last pages of the diary. October 31st, 1721. The massacre was completed. All the savages were killed and their bodies thrown into the river, as ordered by Captain Mendoza. But something terrible happened. At the moment when the last one died, the river reacted. The water became black as ink, and we could see shapes moving in depths. Pouring out so much blood in this sacred place, we did exactly what the savages wanted. I fear we have fed their god with enough sacrifices to arouse something that should remain asleep. November 1st, 1721. 3 soldiers disappeared at night. We found only their clothes on the riverbank. The waters are constantly singing now, day and night. It's a beautiful and terrible song that penetrates dreams and calls the living to join the choir of the dead. November 5th, 1721. More disappearances. Captain Mendoza ordered no one to approach Rio after sunset, but this is not helping. People are leaving their beds at night, walking straight to the waters as sleepwalks. I prayed and fasted, but I feel that anything that has awakened in this place is beyond the power of the common church. November 10th, 1721. I found a temporary solution. There is a stone altar that the savages wore on their rituals. I managed to move it away from the river and select it with blessings. The song stopped, and there was no more disappearances. But I know this is just a temporary containment. If someone moves this altar back to the waters, it will all begin. The last entrance was a desperate prayer, and a plea for the mission to be abandoned and never disturbed. Now we understood everything. Parker had inadvertently broken the seal that kept the furious souls of the parts contained for more than a century. When moving the altar back to the riverbank, he had restarted the deadly cycle. The last night, facing the dead, we went back to Pecos City shortly before dusk, our heavy minds with the knowledge of what we faced. They were not just ghosts or appearances, they were much more dangerous. A collective force of souls that had died in a state of fury and a desire for revenge, fueled by decades of bloodthirsty rituals. "So what is the plan, General?" Morrison asked as we prepare our camp once again in the central square. Honestly, I wasn't sure if there was a plan that could work. How do you fight enemies that are already dead? How do you have a force that exists beyond the reach of bullets and bayonets? "The altar," Bradley said suddenly. "If Parker moves him back, broke the seal, we may restore the containment somehow." "But the altar disappeared," Parker recalled. "The river complained." "Then we will have to recover it," I said, although the words sounded impossible even to me. We spent the remaining hours of daylight preparing us for what could be our last night. We checked our weapons, although we knew that they would probably be useless. We gathered all the wood we could find to maintain a large lit bonfire. Something told us that light would be our only real protection. Santos suggested that we tried to leave before the darkness fell, but I refused. We could not simply escape and let this curse spread. Sooner or later, other settlers would come to this region. Other families would suffer what the residents of Pecos City had suffered. When the first stars appeared, the whispers began again. But this time they were different. More urgent, more furious. It was as if our continuous presence had caused the entities of the river. The figures began to emerge from the waters even before midnight. First, just a few, then dozens. Soon the whole bank was full of spectral forms moving slowly toward us. But tonight, there was something else. Among the dead, we recognized family faces, the missing settlers of the city. Emma Sullivan, the 7-year-old girl, walked between them with empty eyes and water constantly dripping from her mouth. Mr. Hendricks was there too, his face is a mask of eternal resignation. "My God," whispered Parker. "They transformed them. They turned them into more of them." The circle of dead closed slowly around the square. Our weapons were useless. The bullets passed straight through the spectral bodies without effect. We could only watch helplessly as they approached. It was then that Cross did something unexpected. He left the circle of our fire and walked straight toward the dead. "Willie, no!" shouted Morrison, but Cross ignored him. To our surprise, the spectral figures stopped as Cross approached. He reached out, and one of the entities, a Native American woman with long dark hair, did the same. When his hands touched, Cross began to speak, but not in English. They were words in a language that none of us recognized, the same language we heard in the whispers. "He's talking to them," said Bradley, marveling. Somehow Cross is communicating with the dead. The spectral conversation lasted several minutes. Cross nodding, gesturing toward the river, pointing to our fire. Finally he turned and walked back to us. "They want the altar back," he said, his strange and distant voice. "Not to restart rituals, but to destroy it completely. It's the only way to break the cycle and free your souls." "How do you know that?" I asked. Cross touched his forehead where a strange brand had appeared, a spiral symbol that was not there before. "Since last night, when I looked at them, something has changed. I can hear them now, understand what they want." The entities had stopped a few meters from our fire, waiting, Clearly some kind of agreement had been made. "They say the altar is at the bottom of the river," he continued cross, "in a specific place where the waters are deeper. But to recover it, someone will have to go down there. And whoever does it, it will be like them," I completed. It was not a question. Cross nodded sadly. "Water will transform them. But if the altar is destroyed, all souls, including the new ones, will be released. It was an impossible choice. Condemn one of us to eternal death to save everyone else." I looked at my men, Morrison, Bradley, Santos, O'Malley, all good men who trusted me to lead them. How could I ask any of them to make such a sacrifice? "Go," said Cross before anyone could talk. "I've been touched by them. I can already hear them. It's better for me." "No," I answered firmly. "I'm the leader of this expedition. If anyone will do that, I will be me." But Cross shook his head. "General, with all due respect, this is not about leadership or hierarchy. It's about who has already been marked. Look." He showed his arm, where more symbols had appeared, spirals and patterns that seemed to move under his skin like living tattoos. "I have already started transformation last night. If I do not do it now, I will become like them anyway, but without purpose. At least so, my death will mean something." Before we could stop it, Cross walked toward the river. The entities walked, away, creating a way for him. On the bank, he turned one last time. "Tell my family that I died serving Texas," he said. Then he entered the dark waters. The sacrifice of a hero we observed in horrified silence as Cross walked deeper and deeper into the Pecos River. Black water climbed to his knees, then his waist, then his chest. When he arrived at his neck, he paused and looked at us one last time. "I found," he shouted. "I can feel the altar under my feet." Then it disappeared under the surface. For long minutes, nothing happened. The waters remained dark and silent. Spectral. Entities on the margin expected real estate as nightmare statues. We began to fear that Cross's sacrifice had been in vain. Then the water started to bubble, first gently, like a nascent source, then with more violence, as if something immense was fighting deep. The entities on the bank began to make a sound. Not exactly a moan, not exactly a song, but something between the two. It was a sound of relief, of final liberation. The water continued to stir for a few more minutes. Then, gradually, it began to lighten. The black and blurred color that had characterized the Pecos River for over a century began to dissipate, revealing waters that were simply normal. One by one, the spectral entities began to fade. They did not disappear suddenly. It was more like gradually becoming transparent until they finally dissolved completely in the night air. Little Emma Sullivan was the last one from. For a moment, before disappearing, she seemed to smile, the first true smile any of us had seen since we had arrived at this cursed place. When the last entity is gone, a deep and peaceful silence descended over Pecos City. Not the deadly and oppressive silence we had experienced before, but the normal silence of a night in the desert, complete with the distant corner of coyotes and the whisper of the wind through vegetation. Cross never emerged from the waters. The return and the consequences, we stayed in Pecos City for another 3 days, observing and waiting for any sign that supernatural forces could return. But the river was clear and silent, and gradually wildlife began to return to the region. Birds that we had not seen since our arrival reappeared. Small animals came out of hidden burrows. It was as if all nature was awakening from a prolonged nightmare. Parker decided to stay and try to rebuild the city. "Someone needs to be here to tell people who are safe now," he said, "and to make sure the story is preserved so that it never happens again." When we finally departed back to Austin, we loaded with us not only William Cross's memory, but also a profoundly altered understanding of the nature of reality. We had faced forces that existed beyond conventional understanding, forces that history books and modern science would rather ignore. I wrote an official report about our expedition, but omitted the supernatural details. I only mentioned that we solved a problem with hostile insurgents in the part of Pecos City. The truth was simply too unbelievable to be included in official documents. But Morrison, Bradley, Santos, and O'Malley knew, and each of us carried this experience with us for the rest of our lives. It changed our perspective on what was possible, about the mysteries that still existed in the wild lands of Texas. Epilogue: The legacy of mysteries. Years passed. Texas was attached by the United States. Pecos City grew and prospered, becoming an important stop for caravans heading west. The Pecos River is again a normal water body, used for irrigation and transportation. But I never forgot. During my later political career, I have always made a point of investigating reports of supernatural activities in other parts of Texas. I found that our experience in Pecos City was not unique. This land, with its violent history and its mixed cultures, seemed to be particularly susceptible to phenomena that conventional science could not explain. I found reports of ghostly lights dancing over battlefields in San Jacinto, stories of ghost soldiers still marching through the hills around Alamo, reports of voices speaking of ancient Spanish heard in ruins of abandoned missions throughout the state. Texas, I realized, was a land where the past never died completely, where historical trauma left scars that sometimes opened, allowing things from other times to bleed for the present. Morrison continued as a beater until an advanced age, always avoiding the region of parts when possible. Bradley became a doctor in Houston, but maintained a lifelong interest in cases that conventional medicine could not explain. Santos returned to his family in southern Texas, where he became a respected accountant of local stories about him supernatural. O'Malley emigrated to California during the gold race, but his occasional letters always mentioned recurring dreams on dark waters and voices whispering. As for William Cross, he was officially listed as killed in action during a classified mission. Your family received a pension and a medal. They never knew the truth about their sacrifice, that he had given his life not only for Texas, but to free the tortured souls of hundreds of people who had died in terrible circumstances more than a century earlier. The secrets that remain. You may wonder why I'm telling this story now, after all these years. The truth is that, as I get older, I feel the responsibility to preserve these events for posterity. There are mysteries on this earth that should not be forgotten, lessons about the nature of reality that may be important for future generations. Texas is growing rapidly. New settlers arrive every day, always pushing west, to lands that can keep secrets similar to those we find in Pecos City. It is important for these people to know that there is strength in this world that go beyond common understanding. That some places carry the weight of the story in ways that can be dangerous to the unsuspecting. Not all mysteries must be investigated. Not all secrets must be dug up. But when we are confronted with the supernatural, when the impossible becomes undeniably real, we must have the courage to face it with honor and determination. The experience in Pecos City has taught me that heroism sometimes requires sacrifices that go beyond conventional life and death. William Cross faced a destination that was literally worse than death to save countless future lives. His sacrifice was an act of courage that transcended any normal concept of military duty, a warning to the future. If there is a lesson to be learned from the curse of the Pecos River, we must treat the sacred and historical places with respect. Human arrogance, the belief that we can simply take what we want without consequences, is what started all this tragedy. Parker removed the altar because he saw in him an opportunity for profit. The Spaniards massacred an entire tribe because they did not understand or respect their beliefs. In either case, the lack of respect for the holiness of certain places and traditions led to terrible consequences. The West is still full of places like that. Ancient archaeological sites, sacred places for various native tribes, ruins of abandoned settlements in mysterious circumstances. As we expand our presence on these lands, we must do so with humility and caution. Not everything that is old must be preserved, but not everything that is ancient must be discarded lightly. There is a wisdom in cultures that lived on this earth much longer than us, and ignoring this wisdom can have consequences that go far beyond what we can imagine. The call of dark water. Sometimes on silent nights here in Austin, I can still hear echoes from those whispers from the Pecos River. They are not threatening now, more like reminders. Reminder that there is strength in this world that exists beyond politics, beyond war, beyond all the daily concerns that usually occupy our minds. These forces are not necessarily evil, but they are powerful. And when they are disturbed or disrespected, they can become dangerous in ways our civilized education does not prepare us to face. That's why I preserve this story. So the tale now, even though you know that many will discard it as fantasy or superstition. Because I believe it will come a day when someone, somewhere in Texas expanding, will need to know that these mysteries are real. That when the impossible confronts you face to face, courage and sacrifice can prevail where weapons and logic fail. The Pecos River runs clear now, but there are other rivers, other dark places scattered around this vast land. And as we continue our march to the west, we will inevitably find more mysteries that challenge our understanding. When this day comes, I hope we remember the lesson that William Cross has taught us, that sometimes the greatest heroism is not in overcoming the enemy, but in understanding that not all problems can be solved with violence. Sometimes the only solution is the sacrifice, to give ourselves something to restore the balance that has been disturbed. The last reflection. Arriving at the end of this narrative, I must confess that I still fight to completely understand everything we experienced in those dark days in Pecos City. The experience has changed me in ways I'm still discovering. He made me question not only what is possible in this world, but what is our responsibility when confronted with the impossible. As leaders, as human beings, as explorers of unknown land, we have an obligation to approach mysteries with respect and humility. The arrogance that makes us believe that we can simply take what we want, to do what we want without considering the consequences, is what leads to tragedies as we witness. But I also learned that when we face strength beyond our understanding, human courage, combined with compassion and willingness to sacrifice, can prevail. Cross gave his life not for glory or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. And this kind of heroism, even when it is never publicly recognized, can change the course of history. Texas continues to grow and expand. New mysteries will be discovered. New challenges will emerge. And when this happens, I hope we remember the lessons learned in the dark waters of the Pecos River, that we treat the unknown with respect, that we do not allow greed or arrogance to blind us to the consequences of our actions. And let us always remember that sometimes true heroism requires sacrifices that go beyond anything that history books can record. This is my story. These are my memories. And now, finally told, perhaps I can find the peace that Cross and all those we lose in dark waters deserve. The Pecos River runs clear, but the memory remains. And in memory sometimes lies the only immortality we can offer to those who have sacrificed themselves for something greater than themselves. If this story of the Pecos River curse has touched something on you, it has aroused curiosity about the mysteries that still exist in the wild lands of our world, then I ask you to share this narrative. There are other mysteries waiting to be told, other supernatural stories that deserve preservation. Subscribe to follow more reports of the dark secrets that shape our history, because the truth, as strange as it may be, always deserves to be told. And perhaps, just perhaps, these stories will help prepare others for the mysteries that are yet to come. The past never completely dies. He only waits in dark waters and forgotten places until someone brave enough is willing to look beyond the veil of conventional reality. Are you ready for this journey?